In the summer of 2008, deep in the Altai Mountains of Siberia, Russian archaeologists were digging through layers of ancient sediment in a place called Denisova Cave. They'd been excavating this site for decades, pulling out stone tools, animal bones, and the occasional human remain. But on this particular day, they found something unusual. A tiny fragment of bone, a pinky finger, so small it could fit on a teaspoon. The archaeologists labeled it, catalogued it, and sent it off for analysis. Nobody expected what came next. 2 years later, in 2010, a team of geneticists at the Max Planck Institute in Germany extracted DNA from that finger bone. What they found didn't make sense. The DNA didn't match modern humans. It didn't match Neanderthals. It didn't match any known species in the fossil record. This bone belonged to something else entirely. The scientists called them Denisovans, named after the cave where they were found. And with that single finger bone, everything we thought we knew about human history changed. Here's what makes this discovery so unsettling. Denisovans left almost no fossil record, no complete skeletons, no clear idea of what they looked like, just a handful of teeth, a jawbone, and that one tiny finger. But here's the twist that keeps scientists awake at night. Denisovan DNA is alive today, right now, in billions of people across Asia, the Pacific Islands, and even parts of the Americas. You might be carrying Denisovan genes in your body as you watch this. We share our blood with ghosts we've never seen. So if Denisovans are inside us, the question becomes impossible to ignore. Where did they come from? How did they live? And why did they disappear? If you're fascinated by lost histories that challenge everything we thought we knew about being human, hit that subscribe button. Because this story goes deeper than anyone expected. The first clue wasn't in Siberia, it was in the lungs of people living on the roof of the world. Let's travel to Tibet, the Tibetan Plateau, the highest permanently inhabited place on Earth. At 15,000 feet above sea level, the air is thin. Oxygen levels are about 40% lower than at sea level. Most people who climb to these altitudes get sick. Their bodies struggle, their blood thickens as it tries to carry more oxygen. Without proper acclimatization, you can die. But Tibetans, they've lived here for thousands of years. They don't get altitude sickness. Their blood doesn't thicken. They thrive where others can barely breathe. For decades, scientists wondered how this was possible. Then in 2014, a geneticist named Rasmus Nielsen at UC Berkeley decided to sequence the genomes of 40 Tibetans and 40 Han Chinese. He was looking for the genetic difference that allowed Tibetans to survive at extreme altitude. What he found was extraordinary. Tibetans carry a variant of a gene called EPAS1. This gene controls how your body responds to low oxygen. In most humans, when oxygen drops, EPAS1 triggers the production of more red blood cells. Your blood thickens. It's dangerous at high altitude. But the Tibetan variant of EPAS1 works differently. It keeps hemoglobin levels normal even when oxygen is scarce. It's a perfect adaptation to high-altitude life. Nielsen expected this gene to be a recent mutation, something that evolved in Tibetan populations over the last few thousand years. But when he compared the Tibetan EPAS1 gene to other human populations, something bizarre emerged. This gene didn't look like it came from modern humans at all. So Nielsen's team did something unusual. They compared the Tibetan gene sequence to the only Denisovan genome ever sequenced, the one from that finger bone in Siberia. It was a perfect match. A 32.7 kilobase stretch of DNA identical to the Denisovan genome. Found nowhere else on Earth except in Tibetans and a tiny percentage of Han Chinese. Nielsen's conclusion was inescapable. Tibetans didn't evolve this gene. They inherited it from Denisovans, a species that went extinct 40,000 years ago. Let that sink in for a moment. Modern humans, arriving on the Tibetan plateau, met Denisovans who had already adapted to the harsh environment. They interbred. And the children who carried the Denisovan high-altitude gene survived, while those without it didn't. We didn't just replace Denisovans, we borrowed their evolution. We stole their survival tools and made them our own. But altitude wasn't the only gift Denisovans left behind. They left something else buried in our DNA. Something that's kept us alive through plagues, pandemics, and the deadliest diseases in human history. Because hidden in our immune system is a weapon we borrowed from the dead. Fast forward to modern immunology labs. Researchers are sequencing the genomes of people from all over the world, looking for patterns. And they keep finding something strange. On certain immune genes, the ones that help us fight off viruses and bacterial infections, don't quite fit the modern human genetic timeline. These genes show up most strongly in people of Eurasian descent. They're part of a family called toll-like receptors, or TLRs. These are your body's first line of defense. They detect foreign invaders, viruses, bacteria, fungi, and activate your immune response. Without these specific TLR variants, humans would have been far more vulnerable to diseases like tuberculosis, hepatitis B, and Helicobacter pylori when they migrated into Eurasia. So where did these genes come from? From Neanderthals and Denisovans. When modern humans left Africa and moved into Europe and Asia, they encountered diseases they'd never seen before. Their immune systems weren't ready. But Neanderthals and Denisovans had been living in these regions for hundreds of thousands of years. They'd already adapted. And when our ancestors interbred with them, we inherited those adaptations. But here's where the story gets even more interesting. Let's travel to Papua New Guinea, a remote island nation in the Pacific. The indigenous people here, known as Papuans, carry up to 5% Denisovan DNA in their genomes, the highest percentage anywhere on Earth. In 2022, a team led by evolutionary geneticist Irene Gallego-Romero at the University of Melbourne wanted to understand what that Denisovan DNA was actually doing, so they sequenced the genomes of 56 Papuan individuals. What they found was remarkable. Denisovan DNA in Papuans was heavily concentrated in regions of the genome that control immune function, specifically, or genes that regulate the body's response to tropical diseases, malaria, dengue fever, parasitic infections. But the team didn't stop there. They took Denisovan gene variants and tested them in the lab using Papuan cell lines. They wanted to see if these ancient genes were still functional. They were. The Denisovan variants actively regulated nearby immune genes. They fine-tuned the immune response, making it more effective against local pathogens without triggering dangerous inflammation. Think about what this means. 50,000 years ago, modern humans arrived in New Guinea. They encountered an environment filled with diseases they'd never faced, but they also encountered Denisovans, who'd been living there long enough to adapt. The two groups interbred, and the children who inherited Denisovan immune genes survived, while others didn't. Today, those genes are still protecting people in Papua New Guinea. We owe our survival to a species we replaced. But if Denisovans were so genetically valuable, so well adapted, why did they disappear? And if they were mixing with modern humans so frequently, how common was this really? In 2018, archaeologists found proof that these encounters weren't just common. They were intimate. They found the child of two extinct species. And her story changes everything. Let's go back to Denisova Cave, the place where this whole story started. By 2012, archaeologists had excavated over 2,000 bone fragments from the cave. Most were too degraded to identify, animal bones, mostly. But the team knew that buried somewhere in those fragments could be more human remains. So they used a new technique called zooarchaeology by mass spectrometry. Basically, they tested the protein signatures in the bones to figure out which species they came from. One fragment stood out, a tiny piece, barely 2 centimeters long. It was labeled Denisova 11. The protein analysis showed it was human. So the team sent it to geneticists Vivian Slon and Svante Pääbo at the Max Planck Institute. When they sequenced the DNA, they couldn't believe what they were seeing. This bone belonged to a teenage girl, at least 13 years old when she died, about 90,000 years ago. Her mother was a Neanderthal. Her father was a Denisovan. She was a first-generation hybrid, the only one ever discovered. The team nicknamed her Deni. Let's pause and think about what Deni represents. She wasn't an anomaly. She wasn't the result of some rare, accidental encounter between two lost wanderers. If we found her in a single cave, and with only a handful of fossils to work with, that means interbreeding between Neanderthals and Denisovans was common. Svante Pääbo, the Nobel Prize-winning geneticist who led the study, said it best. "We almost caught them in the act." But the story gets even more complex. When the team analyzed Denny's father's genome, they found something unexpected. He also carried Neanderthal DNA, inherited from ancestors hundreds of generations before him. This wasn't a one-time mixing event. Neanderthals and Denisovans were encountering each other repeatedly over thousands of years across vast distances. And here's where the geography becomes important. Denny's Neanderthal mother wasn't related to the Neanderthals who lived in the same Siberian cave. Her genome was more closely related to Neanderthals from Vindiga Cave in Croatia, thousands of miles to the west. That means Neanderthal groups were migrating back and forth across Eurasia, encountering Denisovans, mixing, separating, and mixing again. Denny's existence tells us that the world 90,000 years ago was far more interconnected than we ever imagined. But here's the question that haunts researchers. If Denisovans lived in Siberia, how did their DNA end up in Papua New Guinea, the Philippines, and Australia, separated by thousands of miles of ocean? Because Denisovans didn't just walk across Asia. Somehow, they crossed water. Here's the geographic puzzle that keeps anthropologists up at night. Denisovan DNA is found in two completely separate regions. One in Siberia, where we found the original fossils, and another in Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands, places like Papua New Guinea, the Philippines, and Australia. Between these regions is thousands of miles of ocean. For decades, scientists assumed that early humans couldn't cross large bodies of water. That's why islands like Australia and New Guinea weren't settled until around 50,000 years ago, when modern humans developed the technology to build boats. But Denisovan DNA in these regions tells a different story. Geneticists now believe there were at least two, possibly three, distinct Denisovan populations. One group lived in the cold, mountainous regions of Siberia, another lived along the coasts of Southeast Asia, and a third may have island-hopped into Oceania, crossing what scientists call the Wallace Line, a major oceanic barrier that separates Asian and Australian fauna. But how? If Denisovans crossed the Wallace Line 50,000 years ago, or earlier, they must have had boats, or rafts, some form of watercraft. And if they had boats, that changes everything. Let's look at the archaeological evidence. In Sulawesi, Indonesia, researchers have found ancient cave art dating back 45,000 years. In Borneo, stone tools that don't match modern human technology. In the Philippines, a mysterious hominin species called Homo luzonensis, which some scientists believe may be related to Denisovans. And then there's the environmental DNA. In 2020, researchers extracted Denisovan mitochondrial DNA from sediment layers in Baishia Karst Cave in Tibet. The DNA showed that Denisovans lived there from at least 100,000 years ago until possibly 45,000 years ago. That's a 55,000-year presence in one location, longer than modern humans have existed as a distinct species. Denisovans weren't just passing through. They were settled, established, thriving. And if they were thriving, they were building things, creating tools, developing culture. The question is, what did they create? And can we still find it? The answer was buried in the same cave where we found Denny. Let's return to Denisova Cave one more time. Archaeologists have been excavating this site since the 1970s, and over the decades, they've pulled out thousands of artifacts, stone tools, animal bones, charcoal from ancient fires. But in one layer, dated to around 50,000 years ago, they found something extraordinary. A bracelet, made from polished green stone, perfectly smooth, with a drilled hole for stringing. It's beautiful, it's sophisticated, and it's unmistakably symbolic. Whoever made this bracelet wasn't just surviving, they were thinking symbolically. They were creating art. And based on the dating and the layers where it was found, it's likely Denisovan. But that's not all. In the same layers, archaeologists found advanced stone blades, bone needles, and animal tooth pendants. One of those bone needles, dated to 50,000 years ago, is the oldest ever found in northern Eurasia. Bone needles are significant because they suggest the creation of fitted clothing. That requires planning, skill, and an understanding of materials. These artifacts show us that Denisovans were technologically sophisticated. They weren't primitive, they were innovators. But here's where the story takes an even more remarkable turn. In 2019, researchers announced the discovery of a Denisovan jawbone found in Baishia Karst Cave beyond the Tibetan Plateau at an elevation of 10,560 feet. This jawbone, called the Shiahe mandible, was found by a Tibetan monk back in 1980. For decades, it sat in a collection at Lanzhou University, unstudied. When scientists finally analyzed it using ancient protein techniques, they confirmed it was Denisovan. And uranium dating of the carbonate crust around it showed it was at least 160,000 years old. This is the oldest Denisovan fossil ever found. And it's the highest altitude hominin fossil in the world. Think about what this means. Denisovans were living on the Tibetan Plateau 160,000 years ago, long before modern humans arrived. They adapted to high-altitude, low-oxygen environments tens of thousands of years before we did. That EPAS1 gene Tibetans carry? And Denisovans evolved it over millennia of living in the harshest conditions on Earth. And now we carry it. But here's the haunting part. Denisovans had culture, they had technology, they probably had language. But we'll never hear their voices. We'll never know their stories. Unless those stories survived in a different way. Because in the mountains of Tibet, there are ancient myths, legends of wild men who lived in caves, beings who avoided contact with humans, who hunted at night, who could survive where others couldn't breathe, and the timing is too perfect to ignore. Across Tibet, Nepal, and parts of China, there are old stories, passed down through generations. Stories about strange beings who lived in the mountains. They were called by different names: mountain men, wild men, cave dwellers. These beings were described as large, strong, covered in hair. They avoided human contact. They lived at extreme altitudes, and they survived in conditions that would kill ordinary people. For most of history, these were dismissed as folklore, legends, maybe inspired by sightings of large animals like bears or yaks. But when you line up the timeline, something strange emerges. Denisovan DNA in Baishia Cave shows continuous occupation from 160,000 years ago until at least 60,000 years ago. Some sediment samples suggest Denisovans may have been there as recently as 45,000 years ago. Modern humans arrived on the Tibetan Plateau around 40,000 years ago. That means there's a potential overlap, a window of time where modern humans and Denisovans could have coexisted in the same region. Did early Tibetans encounter Denisovans? We have no direct evidence, no cave paintings showing both species together, no clear proof. But we have something else. We have myths that describe beings with physical traits that match what we know about Denisovans: large teeth, robust builds, and most eerily, the ability to survive at high altitudes where others would suffocate, the same trait conferred by the Denisovan EPAS1 gene. Now, here's the question. Can myths preserve genetic memory? Can stories passed down over 40,000 years actually reflect real encounters? Most scientists would say, no. Oral traditions degrade. Details change. After enough time, the original events become unrecognizable. But genetic memory is different. If Tibetans carry Denisovan DNA, if that DNA helped their ancestors survive, then those ancestors had direct contact with Denisovans. They saw them, lived alongside them, maybe even raised children with them. And if those encounters were significant enough to shape survival, they were significant enough to be remembered. Whether those memories survived as myths, we may never know for certain. But here's what we do know. Denisovan DNA is still in us, and some of it is still active, still functional, still influencing how our bodies work. In fact, scientists have recently discovered something extraordinary. There are parts of Denisovan DNA in modern humans that don't do anything until they need to. These genes are sleeping, waiting, and when the right conditions arrive, they wake up. Let's talk about what we don't understand. When geneticists sequence Denisovan DNA and compare it to modern human genomes, they find regions they can't explain, on sequences that don't match any known function in our biology. Scientists call these dark regions. Some of these sequences are linked to brain development, neural wiring, cognitive function, and that raises an uncomfortable question. Did Denisovans think differently than we do? We know from the limited fossils that Denisovans were physically different. Their molars were larger than ours, their jaws broader, and based on skull fragments, their brain cases may have been larger than Neanderthals. But brain size doesn't tell us how the brain worked. What we do know is this. Denisovan DNA in modern humans sometimes influences neurological traits. A recent study in 2024 looked at two distinct populations in Papua New Guinea, highlanders living in the mountains and lowlanders living near the coast. Researchers found that these two groups have different concentrations of Denisovan DNA. Highlanders have Denisovan genes linked to brain development and cognition. Lowlanders have Denisovan genes linked to immune function and pathogen resistance. This suggests that Denisovan DNA isn't just random noise in our genome, it's functional, and it's being selected for based on environment. But here's what keeps scientists fascinated. Every time a species goes extinct, we lose genetic diversity. We lose potential adaptations that could have helped future generations. Denisovans carried genes we'll never fully understand, traits that might have made them better suited to certain environments, ways of thinking that we can't reconstruct. And because they left so few fossils, we're piecing together their existence from shadows and fragments. But there's one Denisovan gene that we do understand, and it's one of the strangest, because this gene doesn't work all the time. It only activates when your body needs it most. Here's a concept that challenges how we think about genetics. Most people assume that if you carry a gene, it's always active, always doing something. But that's not how it works. Many genes are regulated. They turn on and off depending on signals from your environment, your diet, your stress levels, even your altitude. And Denisovan genes are no exception. Let's go back to Tibet. Researchers studying the EPAS1 gene noticed something unusual. In lowland Han Chinese populations, people who carry the Denisovan variant don't show any obvious benefit. Their hemoglobin levels are normal. The gene isn't doing much. But the moment those same people move to high altitude, the gene activates. It prevents their blood from thickening. It keeps their oxygen transport efficient. It allows them to function at 15,000 feet without getting sick. The gene was waiting. And it's not just altitude. Studies of Pacific Islander populations, particularly those with a history of deep-sea diving, suggest similar patterns. Genes linked to oxygen metabolism, breath holding, and pressure resistance show signs of Denisovan ancestry. These populations didn't evolve these traits independently. They inherited them, and those genes only activate when needed. This is what scientists call evolutionary insurance. Denisovan DNA sits quietly in our genome, dormant, inactive, waiting for an environmental trigger. And when that trigger arrives, high altitude, low oxygen, extreme cold, the genes switch on. So we're carrying genetic adaptations for environments our recent ancestors never faced, backup systems encoded by a species that went extinct 40,000 years ago. Which brings us to the most unsettling question of all. If Denisovan DNA is still functional, still helping modern humans survive, are Denisovans truly extinct? Or are they still here, hidden inside us, waiting for the right moment to express themselves? But Denisovans aren't the end of the story. In 2023, scientists found evidence of something even older. Something that interbred with Denisovans before Denisovans ever met us. A ghost inside a ghost. This is where the story gets almost unbelievable. When geneticists analyzed the high-quality Denisovan genome from Denisova Cave, they noticed something strange in the data. There were sections of DNA that didn't fit, on sequences that were too different from both modern humans and Neanderthals. Too old. After running multiple analyses, the conclusion was unavoidable. Denisovans carried DNA from another, even more ancient human species, one that diverged from our lineage over 1 million years ago. Scientists call this the super-archaic population. We don't know what they looked like, we don't have any fossils, we don't even have a name for them, but we know they existed because they left their mark in Denisovan DNA. And through Denisovans, their genes may still exist in us. Think about what this means. At some point in the distant past, there were at least 4 human species alive on Earth at the same time. Modern humans, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and this unknown super-archaic group, each with different bodies, different brains, different cultures. They overlapped, they encountered each other, they interbred, and through that mixing, they passed on genetic traits that helped their descendants survive. But here's the question that anthropologists wrestle with. Why are we the only ones left? Why did Neanderthals disappear? Why did Denisovans go extinct? Why did this super-archaic group vanish? Was it because we were smarter, stronger, better adapted? Or was it something else? Some scientists argue that we didn't outcompete them. We absorbed them. Modern humans didn't replace Neanderthals and Denisovans. We interbred with them so extensively that they ceased to exist as separate populations. Their DNA lives on in us. Their genes help us survive. But their cultures, their languages, their unique ways of seeing the world, those are gone. We are the last human species standing. Well, not because we were the best, but because we were the most willing to mix, the most adaptable, the most ruthless when we needed to be. And that raises a haunting possibility. If there's a 4th human species hidden in our DNA, what else are we missing? What other ghosts are buried in our genome, waiting to be discovered? Because the story isn't over. In Siberia, in Tibet, in caves across Asia, there are layers archaeologists haven't excavated, sediments they haven't tested, and in those layers, there may be more. Let's return one last time to Denisova Cave. It's 2025. Excavations are ongoing, and the deeper archaeologists dig, the older the layers become. Some sediments in this cave are 300,000 years old, and they're largely untouched. The team knows there are more Denisovan fossils down there. Statistically, there have to be. But finding them is painstaking work. Every bone fragment has to be tested, every layer carefully documented. What researchers really want is a skull. A complete Denisovan skull would answer so many questions. What did they look like? How large were their brains? Did they resemble Neanderthals, or were they something entirely different? In 2024, researchers identified a Denisovan rib bone from Papua Cave in Tibet, dated between 48,000 and 32,000 years ago. It extends the timeline of Denisovan presence even further. But a rib doesn't tell us much about appearance. The breakthrough, if it comes, will likely come from new technology. Scientists can now extract ancient DNA from cave dirt, from sediment, from animal bones that Denisovans butchered and left behind. They don't need human fossils anymore. In fact, some of the most important Denisovan discoveries in recent years have come from environmental DNA. Genetic traces left in the soil, preserved for tens of thousands of years. This technology is revolutionizing archaeology, and it raises an exciting possibility. If we can extract DNA from sediment in Denisova Cave, we can do the same in other caves across Asia, in Indonesia, in the Philippines, in China. There may be Denisovan DNA in places we haven't even looked yet, so the story isn't over. Not even close. Every year, we learn something new, every excavation reveals another piece of the puzzle, and every discovery forces us to reconsider what it means to be human. Because the truth is this, we are not one species, we never were. We are a mosaic, a patchwork of ancient lineages woven together through thousands of generations of mixing, migration, and survival. Denisovan DNA flows through the veins of billions of people alive today. Their genes help us breathe at high altitudes, fight off diseases, adapt to new environments. They are not extinct, they are part of us. And maybe that's the real lesson. The story of humanity isn't written in history books. It's not found in monuments or ancient texts. It's written in bone, buried in frozen ground, encoded in our blood. And some chapters of that story are still frozen, still waiting, still speaking. We just have to listen.